Welcome to this authors and conversation panel featuring all of the 2020 Minnesota Book Award finalists in the novel and short story category. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota and the novel and short story category through the generosity of the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University. Joining me today are Sheila O'Connor, author of Evidence of V, a novel in Fragments, Facts, and Fictions, published by Rose Meadow Press. Nancy Hedin, author of Stray, published by Nine Star Press. Benjamin Percy, author of Suicide Woods, published by Grey Wolf Press. And William Kent Krueger, author of This Tender Land, published by Atria Books, Simon & Schuster. And I'm Peter Geye, winner of the Minnesota Book Award in the novel and short story category back in 2017. Being a lifelong Minnesotan, I count that honor among the highest of my professional life. I have a new book called Northernmost coming out in August. I'm excited to spend the next little while talking with some of my favorite writers. We're happy to have you all with us this afternoon in what are truly unprecedented times. Not only have the Minnesota Book Awards been relegated to a virtual event, but it seems like just about everything else in life has too. One of the ways I'm getting through these days is by filling them with stories, writing them, teaching them, but most joyfully, just simply reading them. With that in mind, I'd like to begin today's conversation by having each of our distinguished finalists share a short passage from their books. I hope these readings will not only introduce us, however briefly, to the work of these fine writers, but in doing that, give us at least a moment's reprieve from the historical moment we find ourselves in. So Sheila O'Connor, would you be willing to get us started?
Yes. I'll start on probably just a few pages into the book, and this page, interestingly enough, is called How It Starts. Minneapolis, 1935. V floats like a feather far from school, late November loose, a pain in her back tooth that can't be fixed, hunger acid in her belly, her best friend M beside her, a tether to this world. Always V and M end up downtown, V performing on the streets, singing for the men who still have money for young girls. A dime a dance, M calls, a nickel for a song. M, the stubborn banker, holds the sailor cap for coins, money they will save for a picture show and popcorn or a quick stop at the lolly jar on 6th. V cans and she shimmies, sings, Ain't We Got Fun, then lands hard for a laugh. 1 week into 15, V's a red-haired Ruby Keeler, a Ziegfeld Follies hopeful, sure she'll be discovered. V has what it takes to be a star. You've got talent, one man says, his face as clean as a fresh page, his hands as smooth as snow, his thumb under her chin like a good father. V's good father has been dead for 5 hard years. You shouldn't waste it on the street. I could put you on the stage. The stage, V says, her heart falling to his hands. How much, M asks. M is the accountant. M always knows exactly what V's worth. More than this, he says, pulling a quarter from his pocket and slipping it in V's. More than you earn now.
Amazing. Thanks, Sheila. Nancy, would you go next, please?
Stray. I'm going to read from the opening. It was supper time on a weeknight, and there were 2 vehicles I didn't recognize and a hearse parked next to our farmhouse. Okay, it really wasn't a hearse. It was Pastor Grind's tan Toyota, but any visit from him meant bad news. God, how I hope Mama had started a book club or extorted people to attend a Tupperware party. More likely, she was bringing a parade of potential husbands. She wanted to straighten out her queer daughter, me. Lorraine! Mama came rumbling out of the house onto the open front porch, waving her arms. Don't change out of your college clothes. We have guests for dinner. It's not like I usually change clothes in the yard. I parked my truck in between Dad's beat-up pickup and Mama's dented station wagon. Mama had parked on half the pink flamingo pair of lawn ornaments Dad had installed the day before. We're having chicken. Ricky wants to learn how to make my gravy. Mama wiped her hands on her denim apron. Before I could ask who Ricky was, like I didn't already know he was some guy she found at college and deems him a good husband for me, the only requirement being a penis in his pants, she put her hands on her wide hips. That Charity girl is here too, but she's not staying. Mama swiveled around and marched to the house.
Wonderful. Thank you. Ben, your turn.
This is from a short story called Writs of Possession. Tonight, the mother reads the little boy the story, Harold and the Purple Crayon. They lay side by side in his bed, and when she finishes, when she snaps shut the book, he says to her, "Will you stay a little longer? To cuddle, Mama." She tells him no. She has to go. He has to sleep. "Just for a minute," he says. "A mini minute," she says, and remains curled up by him for a few breaths before climbing out of bed and pulling the covers up to his chin. "Don't leave," he says. And she says she has to, and kisses his forehead and lets her lips linger there another moment before she snaps off the light, says goodnight, closes the door. He's not scared of the dark. He's not worried about monsters beneath his bed or aliens at the window. It's his mother, whose eyes are red-rimmed, whose hair is going gray at the roots because she hasn't been to the salon in months, who worries him. He hears her crying through the walls. He hears her on the phone. "We're underwater," she keeps saying, along with that word foreclosure. They are going into foreclosure. One night he asked her where it was, foreclosure. "I'm sorry," she said, and he said, "You keep saying we're going there, to foreclosure." Her lips flattened and her eyebrows came together, and she asked him if he wanted to watch cartoons. Would he like that? He has heard at Sunday school the story of Noah and the ark that survived the great flood. And he has seen on the news the waters that rose up from a river to swallow towns in a place called Iowa. This is what his mother is worried about, he feels certain. This is why she is packing all of their things into boxes and suitcases. A flood is coming, and its waters will be black and roiling with terrible fish, their eyes white, their fangs thin and crooked. He imagines the first wave of the flood surging along the street, splashing against the side of their house, foaming and reeking of the fish that wait outside, gnawing at the wood. The water will seep under the doors and burble its way down the hallway, rising, rising. He needs to work quickly, and he knows his mother might notice the light under his door. So he pulls the shades instead, allowing the moon into his room, its light silvering the walls. Slowly, he slides open his closet door. From a shelf devoted to art supplies, he pulls down a box of crayons and fumbles through them until he chooses the one he thinks to be purple, though it could just as well be black in this uncertain moonlight. And there, on the wall, he begins to draw a boat, one big enough for the two of them, to carry them away to foreclosure.
And Ken?
Thank you, Peter. You know, if I could have one gift that God chose not to give me, it would be Ben Percy's voice. I'm going to read from the prologue to This Tender Land. In the beginning, after he labored over the heavens and the earth, the light and the dark, the land and sea and all living things that dwell therein. After he created man and woman, and before he rested, I believe God gave us one final gift. Lest we forget the divine source of all that beauty, he gave us stories. I am a storyteller. I live in a house in the shade of a sycamore tree on the banks of the Gilead River. My great-grandchildren, when they visit me here, call me old. Old is a cliché, I tell them with mock disappointment, a terrible trivializing, an insult. I was born along with the sun and earth and moon and planets and all the stars. Every atom of my being was there at the very beginning. You're a liar. They scowl, but playfully. Not a liar, a storyteller, I remind them. Then tell us a story, they plead. The events I'm about to share with you began on the banks of the Gilead. Even if you grew up in the heartland, you may not remember these things. What happened in the summer of 1932 is most important to those who experienced it, and there are not many of us left. The Gilead is a lovely river, lined with cottonwoods already ancient when I was a boy. Things were different then, not simpler or better, just different. We didn't travel the way we do now, and for most folks in Fremont County, Minnesota, the world was limited to the piece of it they could see before the horizon cut off the land. They wouldn't have understood any more than I did that if you kill a man, you are changed forever. If that man comes back to life, you are transformed. I have witnessed this and other miracles with my own eyes. So among the many pieces of wisdom life has offered me over all these years is this: open yourself to every possibility, for there is nothing your heart can imagine that is not so. The tale I'm going to tell is of a summer long ago, of killing and kidnapping and children pursued by demons of 1,000 names. There will be courage in this story and cowardice. There will be love and betrayal. And of course, there will be hope. In the end, isn't that what every good story is about?
It's wonderful. Thank you. One of the things that I'm constantly finding reassurance in is the bounty of literary talent and camaraderie Minnesota has to offer. And the work of you all is a big part of that for sure. I'll soon ask each of you a question about how you view your work in the context of the wider world. But first, I'd like to stay close to home for a minute and ask each of you how you view the literary community here in Minnesota. What does it mean to you to be a part of? Nancy, let's begin with you.
I started at the Loft years ago and found a literary community there. And then while I was taking a short story class, it was suggested I might want to get an MFA at Hamlin. So I've been very blessed between the Loft and then doing an MFA at Hamlin and meeting so many people. This is a place where, well, keep your day job, because you aren't going to be rich necessarily or anything, but this is a great supportive place, and both from other artists and also from the reading and spectator community. So it's been wonderful. I've had the unique problem of having being published by a small press. So a lot of my sales have come through breweries. So I've been hanging out in microbreweries, selling my book and giving away things to attract people to the table. And what's been impressive is how many people want to support Minnesota art and Minnesota authors, and whether they're drawn to, some are obviously drawn to the story, but a lot of people just stop and buy because it's somebody from Minnesota who's doing the work. And I think that's great.
Yeah, that's terrific. Ben, how about you?
We made the choice to move to Minnesota 9 years ago, and the landscape drew us here, the progressive politics, closeness to family. but so did the arts culture. If you look at what's going on in the writing community, we have publishers like Coffee House, Grey Wolf, Milkweed. We have dozens of incredible indie bookstores. We have periodicals like Rain Taxi. We have literary hubs like The Loft and festivals like Wordplay and the Twin Cities Book Festival. And I would say that, you know, it is second only to New York in the vibrancy of its literary landscape.
Couldn't agree more with that. Kent, how about you?
You know, like Nancy, I kind of dipped my toes into the literary water here via the Loft. I came to Minnesota 40 years ago, and the Loft was still in its infancy, and I began taking some classes there from some really fine instructors. You know, I do a lot of events around the country, and Minnesota has this incredible reputation as a center for fine literary work. I think it's not just the literary work here that gets supported by Minnesotans. We, as a people, made a commitment a long time ago in supporting our arts and our artists. So we have great writers here, but we also have great actors here. We have great theater here. We have great artists here. We have great dance here. And it's this willingness on the part of the people of Minnesota to support financially, to support with attendance, to support with book purchases, all of the artists who have chosen to work here. I just think it's an incredibly vibrant place. There is an energy here that I haven't seen or felt anywhere else.
Sheila, how about you?
You know, I get asked this question a lot about being a writer in Minnesota because there's so many of us, for one thing, you know, and I think for me, it is a sense of being in a larger community, not just here in the Twin Cities, but writers all across the state that are doing work across genres and across forms. And it gives me a sense of living in a place where people's voices matter. And I will echo what Ken said, and not just that their voices as they are expressed in writing matter, but in all of the art forms matter. And and through writing is how I think we come to understand so many different people's experiences in Minnesota, and what it means to be a person here, whether you're documenting the immigrant culture here, the urban culture, the rural culture, being a person of color in Minnesota. And these voices just seem to be, they just rise up and they inform my thinking and they change me as a person. And I'm just always really grateful to be in that company.
Yeah. I mentioned before the unprecedented times we're in, and I can't help wonder, as days turn into weeks and months, what our community is going to look like on the other side of this. I realize wondering these things is not original, that we're all filled with thoughts of, curiosity, but also in a lot of cases, anxiety or dread or certainly uncertainty. And as I was thinking about that, it occurred to me that the work of novelists and short story writers and fiction writers is often a thought exercise not unlike the one we're actually living through. And so I want to ask each of you to spend a minute or two describing how you view your work in the larger context of this moment, of this pandemic. Has what's important changed? Has art as a concept changed? Do you view your work differently, having lived, as we all have, through the first wave of these times? Do you see your subjects and motivations changing as we move forward? Ben, how about you?
Turns out a pandemic isn't the best time to have a great imagination. I admit that 3 weeks ago, my nerves were pretty fried and I was finding it difficult to concentrate. But since then, I've tried to limit my news intake and focus on family and productivity and getting out in nature. And partly because of that, and partly because of our state's, response, which was way ahead of the curve of other places. I feel like I'm in a much better place right now. And the question that arrests me isn't, the constant hypothetical of when this is going to end, because it will end and that's beyond my control. Instead, I'm wondering about the effect this will have on the arts, because, here I am at the keyboard hammering away, and it's an escape for me, and hopefully it will be a helpful escape for others. But will we see a shift in sort of the purpose or even the form of art as a result of all this and the fallout from all of this? If you look at what happened to everything from painting to literature after World War I and the 1918 pandemic, are we going to see something similar here? And to the best, to the best of my ability, I'm anticipating a time of fracture in form and format and content. And I'm trying to lean into that in some of the things that I'm brainstorming, because I'm working on, a novel right now, and I'm working on a podcast right now, and I'm working on comics right now. But part of me wonders, am I currently working on what is going to be regarded as historical fiction? Because I feel like I need to look ahead, because there'll be a line when all this is over. There'll be a then and there'll be a now. And I'm really curious about what that now looks like.
Kent, what about you?
Well, I have to confess that the self isolation, the sheltering in place order hasn't changed very much at all how I approach my work. I still get up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I fix myself a cup of coffee. I sit down to my laptop and I write for a couple of hours. What may change going forward, I think, is the format, not so much for literature, because what we write is still available as ebooks. You can still order our books from wherever you happen to choose to order them. The real thing will still come to you, and you can hold it in your hands. But for so many of the other arts, I think we may see a dramatic shift. I'm thinking, for example, of the Guthrie Theater, who has canceled their season here, the rest of their season. Perhaps going forward, what they'll do is they'll film their productions, and we'll all watch them at home, streaming them on our computer, or the same for dance or anything else. We may see that kind of a shift. I think I hope one of the good things that's going to come from this is that we'll recognize the value that art plays in our lives. I'm thinking about stories, for example. Stories don't just entertain us, but they enlighten us, and they encourage us, and they inspire us. Stories give us hope. So looking forward, that's sort of how I look at my work. I look at the stories I write, hopefully as a way to offer hope for people in a world that sometimes seems a little on the hopeless side.
Well said. Sheila, how about you?
I think for me, every book that I write, if I take on a project that's going to unfold over several years, many years that it's going to take me to write it, I'm always wondering where I am in a broader conversation. Like, there's the world, and what is it that I have to say about the world, or what can I bring to, I guess, to the conversation. And right now I'm uncertain about that, because I don't know what the conversation, I feel that I'm in so much of a middle hour, like there's going to be the before and there's going to be the after. And this is right now where I'm occupying a time. And it's hard for me to know what I'm going to want to say both out of this time and beyond this time, if that makes any sense. And I'm writing, I'm doing what all you're doing. I'm just sitting down and doing my work, but I can't help but wonder where the place of the story I'm currently working on will be when people come out of it changed. But this has honestly been true of every book that I've done, particularly in the last, probably 10 years, where things have changed so rapidly in America, and major things have occurred here that have shifted the way we see all kinds of things. So sometimes my books are already obsolete before they hit the shelves, I think.
Nancy?
I've been asking myself during this time period, oh, should I be writing a COVID story? But I realize in my work, my characters are dealing with disenfranchisement and isolation. So in some ways, this time period has paralleled some of the work that I feel I've been trying to do. And it spotlighted how isolated we can be in our society, and how we also then adapt through these electronic things. Or I'm an essential employee, which is odd to say, but I work in mental health crisis, so I'm still going out to see people in their homes, and they're coming in to see us. And social work has always been a part of my life. So in some ways, this time period isn't new to me. I mean, I'm restricted from gathering in these big groups and so forth. But I've always had kind of a finger on the pulse and an awareness of the isolation that's already out there, and the separateness and the differences because of poverty and opportunity. And that's what my work will always, I think, reflect, will be those differences, but also how the people have more things in common than they have different. Just as this pandemic is an equal opportunity virus, tragedy and trauma and good things, births and weddings and all these different things are also equal opportunity fodder for our stories. So I think we're going to make some really great stories from this time period. And we're going to look back and be humbled with the experience.
I think you're right. Kent, this one's for you. You're one of the most popular writers, not only in Minnesota, but all across the country and the world. And a large part of your star is attached to the Cork O'Connor mystery series. But you've also written two really beautiful and much quieter books, including this Tender Land, which is a finalist this year for the Minnesota Book Award. And I suspect you've been asked this question before, but since I've never heard the answer, I'm going to risk it anyway, because I'm dying to know. But I wonder what factors go into you placing your stories in a particular genre. How do you decide whether a mystery or a more literary form is the better vessel? And finally, do you have a more natural affinity for one or the other genres of storytelling in terms of what you like to read?
Whoa, what a big question. My bread and butter is the Cork O'Connor series. I've been writing it for 20 years now. And that's how people came to know me initially. When I turned to fiction that fell, strictly speaking, outside the genre, with Ordinary Grace initially, and now with this Tender Land, it was a risky proposition for me, but they were both stories that spoke to me in just a tremendously compelling way. But if you look at the two stories, the way they're structured, Suspense is a significant part of the stories. There is mystery at the heart of them, because I cut my teeth on mysteries. And so for me, very early on, I learned that it's important to grab a reader's interest quickly. It's important to keep a pace going that will just pull the reader all the way through the story. And I've never worried about whether they were going to be classified as mysteries as such or literary works as such. I just write the stories the way they come to me, and then I let I let the booksellers decide where on the shelves they're going to put them.
Sheila, I remember years ago talking to you about this novel of yours, Evidence of V, as you were working on it. And I've been fascinated, I must say, with the idea ever since. It's a not so thinly veiled account of your maternal grandmother's life. A gut-wrenching story told in fragments, some of them not fiction at all, about what happened to her. I wonder if you can describe the process of coming up with the idea for this book, what form it would take, or did take, how best to tell a story, and maybe if you could also explain what it was like to come to terms with, if terms is what you came to, with the facts of her life. Did it take a toll on you personally?
Oh, that is also such a big question. Peter, it was interesting. After I had read Lighthouse Road, I very ambitiously thought, I know exactly how I'm going to tell this story. And I'm not kidding you, I have the whole notebook filled, inspired by Lighthouse Road, of how I was going to tell the story. And that was going to be a good book. But every time I tried to tell the book as a traditional novel, and the kinds of traditional, well, traditional is not the right word, but anyway, a more standard form novel, I just found that the story eluded me. I couldn't get my hands on it. And I think that the problem was that what I really was trying to write about was absence and a lack of information, and an inability to ever know something. And that was in part, I think, what landed me closer to the form. When it was later from when I did that, and actually this was a story that I had really started working on when I was in graduate school at Iowa as a poet, and I began it as a play. It always was a story that was in search of form, and I write across form, and I'm open to anything finding its form. And this just eventually found its form in these pieces. Then on top of the fictional pieces that I had, I did have these historical documents, and I wanted the reader to be able to put the story together in the exact same way that I, in all of my years of research, was putting together, which was pieces. And that was all I had, and that was all the reader was going to have. So in many ways, I think the reader processes the attempt to write the book in the exact same way that I am attempting to write the book. The book, I think, was useful for me as a human to understand maybe the inherited trauma within my own family, but in a larger way to uncover that this was a story not just of my grandmother, but literally tens of thousands of girls across America and then across the world where this was happening at this time. And to see that their voices had been completely silenced has made me just so committed, I guess, over the long run to making a space for those stories, which exceed my own ability as a fiction writer. I don't need to keep telling them. I just would like to make a space for the actual women who were incarcerated and their descendants to tell the stories.
Thank you. Nancy, Stray is your second novel set in the fictional town of Bend, Minnesota. It's the sort of place many of us drive through on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon, but very few of us grow up in, much less navigate the perils of adulthood in. I wonder what draws you to writing about this part of the world. What sorts of things might more reliably happen in a place like Bend than, say, Minneapolis or St. Paul or New York City? And did you yourself grow up in a town like this?
Bend is patterned after Swanville, Minnesota, a town of 342 when everyone was home at Christmas for school break and so forth. So that's where I grew up. And the people in Swanville know that Bend is Swanville. I use that context because I think for a lot of people, their first novel is kind of a coming out story, coming of age story, I should say. And for me, that was the truth. And I wanted to keep telling that story, which doesn't mirror my life or exactly. But I had a picture of how it was going to end. This is Stray is the second book of a trilogy, and I just finished Rise, and my agent has that now. So Bend will surface again with a continued story that'll kind of draw this whole story to a close. I loved growing up in a small town. I probably hated it at the time and judged myself for it, but the people in Swanville are like the people in Bend, only they're probably smarter and better looking than Bend and kinder than some of the people in Bend. It was a way to pay some homage to my hometown experience. And I had more experience with that than I did big cities.
Fabulous. Ben, your imagination seems especially well suited to contemplate these times, as you often write about the darker aspects of society and life. You're also one of the most diverse writers I know, publishing craft books and thrillers and comic books and novels and short stories. And I know that through all of that, you're an advocate of excitement in the written word, and that you have a rich and varied set of influences. In Suicide Woods, the final story is a novella called The Uncharted, and I've heard you say it's influenced by Shirley Jackson. Can you tell us about your influences generally and about Miss Jackson with respect to this particular story?
I apologize to everyone that you're currently living in a Ben Percy story. Hopefully it'll be in the rear view sooner than later. A few years ago, I started talking to Steve Woodward, my editor at Grey Wolf, about doing a third collection of stories. And I've had a big steaming pile of fiction because I hammer out many short stories every year. And the first question was, how can we cull from this? How can we shape it into something that is a book, not just a bunch of stories smashed between two covers, but something that is, holistically makes sense. And we wanted it to be a response to Thrill Me, which is a craft book that came out a few years back. And Thrill Me was all about, occupying the borderlands between literary and genre fiction and writing stories that are both artfully told and compulsively readable. So with that in mind, we got to work, and I refined some stories that had been previously published, and I also began to hammer out a few new ones. And they all are sort of united by this clash between civilization and wilderness, man in the wild and the wild in man. And they're also, generally speaking, they all have a sort of craft incentive. I always want to keep raising the hurdles before me. I always like to have a challenge to take on something that I've never accomplished before on the page that sort of carries me forward. So for instance, a lot of the stories are nonlinear in their design. And the idea behind that, especially with the mystery stories, was to create a modular format that's somewhat equivalent to books like Mrs. Bridge by Evan Connell, or movies like 21 Grams or Memento, and make the reader lean forward and become participatory and a kind of detective, to become more complicit in the narrative so that they're piecing it together themselves. With the final story, the novella The Uncharted, I was thinking about Shirley Jackson, and especially about the mother of all haunted house stories, The Haunting of Hill House. And one of the things I love about that story is how it takes this trope of horror, the terrible place, and it filters it through an unreliable point of view. So you're never sure if Hill House is the cause of all these horrors, or if it's Eleanor herself through which you're encountering this place. And you see that in many other stories. You see it, for instance, with the Overlook Hotel and Jack Torrance in The Shining. So I leaned into that and wrote about an actual place, the Bermuda Triangle of the North, a section of Alaska that has the most missing persons cases every year. And instead of having one unreliable point of view, I cycle between many. And there's sort of a wheeling confusion that results, and you're not sure who to trust, or whether the place itself is the bad guy, or if maybe the company that sends these people into the bush is to blame.
It's a terrific story. I'd like to thank you guys all for being so generous with your time and your thoughts. Congratulate you all on being finalists. For some of you, it's the first time. For others, it's not. I wish you all the best. And of course, I wish all of you and all of the folks listening better times ahead and health in the meantime. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you all.